I understand that I am to blame, and I'm truly sorry for the pain it caused. I hope someday I can be forgiven, as I hope to be able to forgive myself.
What if the most dangerous person in your home wasn't a stranger breaking in, but someone who already knew every door, every routine, and every weakness? On the morning of February 24, 2023, nothing about the quiet suburban home in Fairfax County, Virginia, seemed unusual. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways, where children played without fear, and where danger was something that happened somewhere else. Inside that house lived a family that from the outside appeared stable. Brendan Banfield, his wife Christine Banfield, their young daughter, and the family's au pair, Juliana Pers Magalhaes. But beneath that calm exterior, something had already begun to fracture months earlier. Back in August 2022, Brendan Banfield started a secret relationship with Juliana, the woman hired to help care for his child. She was young, far from home, and living under the same roof as the couple. What began as an inappropriate connection slowly turned into something deeper, hidden behind closed doors and carefully timed interactions. Christine, by all accounts, was unaware of what was unfolding around her. As the months passed, that relationship did not fade, it intensified. According to prosecutors, it evolved into something far more dangerous than an affair. It became a motive. Rather than choosing separation or divorce, investigators later alleged that Brendan and Juliana began discussing a way out that would avoid financial loss, custody complications, and public exposure. The plan, as it would later be revealed in court, was calculated and disturbing. Instead of a direct attack that could easily point back to them, the idea was to bring someone else into the picture, an outsider who could be manipulated into becoming both a weapon and a scapegoat. In the weeks leading up to February 2023, digital footprints began forming. Online accounts were created, messages exchanged, and identities blurred. Prosecutors would later argue that a fake persona, posing as Christine, was used to communicate with a man named Joseph Ryan. He was drawn into a conversation that suggested a consensual encounter involving violent fantasy. Ryan believed he was being invited into something private, something agreed upon. He had no way of knowing he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. Then came the morning everything changed. On February 24, 2023, Ryan arrived at the Banfield home. What he expected was not what he encountered. Inside that house, events unfolded quickly and violently. Christine Banfield was stabbed multiple times, suffering fatal injuries. Joseph Ryan was shot and killed. Within moments, two lives were gone. Shortly after, a 911 call was placed. Brendan Banfield reported that he had walked in on a horrifying scene, an intruder attacking his wife, and claimed he had shot the man in self-defense. To first responders, it initially appeared to fit a tragic but straightforward narrative. A home invasion turned deadly, a husband acting to protect his family. But even in those early moments, there were details that didn't sit right. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the injuries, the lack of forced entry. These were small inconsistencies, but they would become critical as investigators began to take a closer look. At the scene, Christine was found dead from stab wounds. Ryan, the supposed attacker, had been shot. Brendan was alive, his account clear and immediate. He had intervened to stop a violent assault. For a brief period, that explanation held. But investigators didn't stop at the surface. As they processed the scene and began gathering evidence, they turned to digital records, communications, and the relationships within the household. That's when the narrative began to shift. The presence of Juliana in the home raised questions. Her relationship with Brendan, initially unclear, soon came under scrutiny. Phone records, messages, and online activity started to paint a different picture, one that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The idea of a random intruder began to unravel. Instead, what investigators started to see was the outline of a plan, one that involved deception, manipulation, and ultimately, violence designed to look like something else. Joseph Ryan, the man labeled as the attacker, appeared less like a perpetrator and more like someone who had been lured under false pretenses. The digital trail indicated he had been communicating with someone he believed to be Christine, but evidence suggested those messages may not have come from her at all. And if that was true, then his presence in that house wasn't random, it was orchestrated. As the investigation deepened, the timeline leading up to that day became more important than the events themselves. Every message, every interaction, every hidden detail began to connect. What initially looked like a tragic act of self-defense was starting to resemble something far more deliberate. But despite growing suspicions, no immediate arrest was made. Brendan Banfield remained free. For months, the case continued quietly, building piece by piece behind the scenes. Investigators worked through digital evidence, forensic analysis, and witness statements, slowly reconstructing what they believed had really happened inside that home. The truth was no longer simple. It was layered, calculated, and deeply unsettling. And at the center of it all was a question that refused to go away. Was this a desperate act of protection, or a plan that had been set in motion long before that morning ever began? The answer wouldn't come quickly, but when it did, it would change everything. By the time investigators had fully examined the evidence, the story that had once sounded plausible began to collapse under its own weight. The months following February 24, 2023, were not marked by dramatic arrests or public revelations. Instead, they were defined by quiet, methodical work. Detectives revisited every detail, from the crime scene itself to the digital interactions that led Joseph Ryan to that house. What they found was not consistent with a spontaneous act of violence. Forensic analysis played a critical role. The nature of Christine's injuries raised questions about the sequence of events. The scene did not fully support the claim that Brendan had interrupted an ongoing humla news and acted instantly to stop it. Instead, prosecutors would later argue that the attack on Christine had already been carried out as part of a planned act. At the same time, digital evidence continued to grow. Messages tied to the fake online identity revealed a pattern, carefully constructed conversations designed to draw Ryan in. These weren't random exchanges. They were deliberate, specific, and timed in a way that aligned with the events of that day. Investigators began to believe that Ryan had been used. He was not an intruder in the traditional sense. He had been invited, guided, and ultimately placed into a situation where he could be framed as the aggressor. That realization shifted the entire direction of the case. Attention turned more sharply toward Brendan and Juliana. Their relationship, once hidden, became central to understanding motive. What had started as an affair now appeared to be intertwined with the events leading to the Arabic half, Arabic ta, Arabic lamb. In September 2024, more than a year and a half after the killings, authorities made their move. Brendan Banfield was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. The delay reflected the complexity of the case. It had taken time to gather enough evidence to challenge the original narrative. Around the same time, Juliana Persmaglhes reached a plea agreement. Her decision to cooperate marked a turning point. By agreeing to testify, she provided prosecutors with direct insight into what they believed had been planned behind closed doors. Her statements, combined with digital and forensic evidence, strengthened the case against Brendan. When the trial began in January 2026, the courtroom became the place where two completely different versions of reality collided. The prosecution presented a calculated sequence of events, an affair that turned into a conspiracy, a staged scenario designed to eliminate Christine, and a plan that relied on deception to disguise murder as self-defense. They outlined how Ryan had been lured using a false identity, how the scene had been manipulated, and how the timing of events suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The defense, however, maintained a different position. Brendan took the stand in his own defense, admitting to the affair but rejecting the idea of a murder plot. He insisted that what happened that day was exactly what he had reported, that he had walked into a violent situation and acted to protect his wife. It was a claim that now faced significant opposition from the evidence. For jurors, the case was not just about what happened on February 24, but about everything that led up to it. They had to consider whether the evidence pointed to a sudden act of Arabic dal, Arabic fa, Arabic Khalif, Arabic tain, or a plan that had been unfolding for months. The presence of digital manipulation, the testimony of Juliana, and the inconsistencies in the scene all weighed heavily. After deliberating for approximately 9 hours, the jury reached a decision on February 2, 2026. Brendan Banfield was found guilty on all charges, including 2 counts of aggravated murder. The verdict marked the end of a case that had slowly transformed from a suspected home invasion into one of the most unsettling domestic crimes in recent memory. In the days that followed, the outcome was formally confirmed, and the details of the case reached a wider audience. What stood out was not just the violence of the act, but the level of planning and deception involved. At its core, the case was about betrayal. A marriage that appeared intact had been undermined from within. Trust had been replaced by secrecy, and eventually, by something far more destructive. Joseph Ryan's role added another layer of tragedy. Drawn into a situation under false pretenses, he became both a participant and a victim in a plan he likely did not fully understand. And Christine Banfield, the person at the center of it all, lost her life in a scenario that prosecutors argued had been carefully constructed to ensure she never had a chance to see it coming. Sentencing was scheduled for May 8, 2026, where Brendan faced the possibility of life imprisonment. But beyond the legal outcome, the case left behind a deeper question, one that lingers long after the courtroom empties. How well can anyone truly know the people they live with? Because in this case, the danger didn't come from outside the home. It was already inside, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As the verdict settled over the courtroom on February 2, 2026, there was no dramatic outburst, no sudden revelation, just the quiet, heavy finality of a decision that had taken nearly 3 years to reach. For the jury, the pieces had aligned. What once looked like a chaotic act of violence had, over time, revealed itself as something far more controlled. But even with the conviction, the story did not feel complete. Because what made this case linger wasn't just what happened, it was how it happened. During the trial, prosecutors had carefully walked jurors through the structure of the plan they believed Brendan Banfield had carried out. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't impulsive. It was built step by step, beginning with secrecy and ending in irreversible consequences. One of the most unsettling aspects presented in court was the use of digital deception. The fake online identity, created to impersonate Christine, became a central element of the case. Through that identity, conversations were initiated and maintained with Joseph Ryan, drawing him deeper into a scenario he believed was consensual. The messages weren't random or vague. They were specific, calculated, and aligned with a clear objective: to ensure Ryan would come to the house on that exact day. Investigators testified that this digital trail was one of the strongest indicators of premeditation. It showed intent, preparation, and coordination. It also contradicted the idea that Ryan's presence was unexpected. For the prosecution, this was not a coincidence. It was a setup. Juliana Persmagelhe's testimony added another layer. As someone who had been inside the home and inside the relationship, her account helped connect the digital evidence to real-world actions. Her plea agreement meant she had already accepted responsibility for her role, but it also meant she became a key witness in explaining how events unfolded behind closed doors. Her statements supported the theory that the plan was not created overnight. It developed over time, shaped by the relationship she shared with Brendan and the circumstances they wanted to escape. The defense attempted to challenge her credibility, suggesting that her testimony was influenced by her plea deal. But even as those arguments were made, the digital and forensic evidence remained. And that evidence did not rely on interpretation alone. It showed timelines. It showed communication patterns. It showed actions that lined up with the events of February 24, 2023. When Brendan took the stand, his testimony became one of the most closely watched moments of the trial. Speaking in his own defense, he acknowledged the affair but maintained that it had no connection to the killings. He described the moment he entered the home as sudden and chaotic, a situation where he had no time to think, only to react. According to his account, he had walked in on a violent encounter and acted to stop it. But prosecutors pressed on the inconsistencies. They pointed to the lack of forced entry. They questioned the sequence of events. They highlighted the digital evidence that suggested Ryan had been invited, not intruding, and they emphasized the planning that appeared to precede the violence. For the jury, it came down to which version of events was supported by the facts. In the end, they sided with the evidence. The guilty verdict closed one chapter of the case, but it did not erase the impact. For the families involved, the outcome brought a form of resolution, but not closure. Christine Banfield's life had been taken in a way that, according to prosecutors, involved betrayal at the highest level. Joseph Ryan's life had ended in circumstances he likely did not fully understand. And at the center of it all was a home that had once appeared ordinary. In the weeks following the trial, discussions around the case focused not only on the crime itself, but on the methods used. The idea that someone could be lured into a deadly situation through online deception raised broader concerns. It highlighted how digital communication, when manipulated, can become a powerful tool, not just for connection, but for control. The case also brought attention to the dynamics within households. Trust, routine, and familiarity are often seen as sources of safety. But in this instance, those same elements were used to maintain secrecy and avoid suspicion. As the sentencing date approached on May 8, 2026, the legal process moved toward its final stage. Brendan Banfield faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The court would determine the exact consequences, but the verdict had already defined the outcome in the eyes of the law. Still, beyond the legal system, the story remained. It remained in the details. The messages sent under a false identity, the decisions made in private, and the moment when a plan moved from intention to action. It remained in the questions people continued to ask. Not just about what happened, but about how something like this could unfold without being seen. Because in the end, this wasn't a case built on a single moment. It was built on a series of choices. Choices made quietly, choices made deliberately, and choices that, once set in motion, could not be undone. The house in Fairfax County no longer holds the life it once did, but the story that came out of it continues to resonate, not because of how unusual it was, but because of how it challenges the idea of where danger truly comes from. Sometimes it isn't the unknown that poses the greatest risk. Sometimes it's what's already there, hidden in plain sight.